this UNESCO City of Literature talk. My name is Professor Morash, and this evening I'm going to be talking about the art of conversation, Dublin's literary salons. Now, when we talk about Dublin as a literary city, as a writer's city, you start to wonder, okay, what do we mean by that? I mean, Dublin is a UNESCO City of Literature. And there's obvious ways of thinking about that in terms of the great works, Ulysses, Paul Lynch's Prophet Song, works from, say, Jonathan Swift's satires to Paul Emean's poetry or Ivan Boland's poetry. Or we could think of the great institutions. Think of the publishers, the literary pubs, the institutions like the libraries, like this one where I am here in Kevin Street. But apart from all that, there's something that kind of slips through the cracks. There's a piece of the puzzle that we tend not to see. There's a kind of hidden world of Dublin writers. And that's where I want to go today, in behind closed doors to private homes, into the literary salons. So, you're on the guest list. First, however, just think for a minute, what do we mean by a literary salon? Now, the first literary salons actually start in France back in the 17th century. And they were an aristocratic thing. It was primarily aristocratic ladies at court, who decided that having a title or the right bloodline didn't necessarily make you interesting company. And they began to have evenings where they invited around people who were interesting, writers, philosophers, politicians, thinkers. And this developed into a practice, the salon. And like a lot of good things, wine, cheese, it was exported from France and went to England, went to Ireland, and in the 18th century, people began to have literary salons. My colleague in Trinity, Amy Prendergast, has actually written about the Dublin salons in the 18th century, Lady Moira's salons, for instance, which were famous. In the early 19th century, probably the main host of literary salons in London was an Irish aristocrat, Lady Blessington. And at the end of the century, Lady Gregory, the same Lady Gregory, who was one of the founders of the Abbey Theatre along with Yeats, before she took up residence primarily in Coole Park, she spent much of her time with her husband, Sir William Gregory, in London. And if you went to the Gregorys for dinner, you had to expect to have a conversation with somebody like Henry James or Robert Browning or any one of a number of distinguished writers, because she had a salon. And the fact that Lady Gregory was doing that in the 1880s into the 1890s tells us something of what happens to the salon. It begins to migrate from the aristocracy to writers, and it begins to become writers talking to writers. And there was a period right here in Dublin, in the early part of the 20th century, where if you wanted to, every night of the week, you could go to somebody's house, a writer's house, and they would have at-homes, they would have salons, open house. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a tour around the literary salons of Dublin. And we're going to start on Monday night. And if it's Monday night, it must be the Yeatses. In February of 1822, George and W.B. Yeats moved into 82 Merrion Square. Now, like most important decisions that the Yeatses made, they made it by consulting a horoscope. Both W.B. Yeats and his wife were practicing magicians. They both cast horoscopes. George was actually probably the more skilled at actually casting the horoscopes. So in the winter of 1922, when they decided they were going to move to Dublin, George did the obvious thing and asked the stars. And here's the answer she got. She asked, "Am I right to go look at houses in Dublin at once?" And the horoscope told her, "Moon going to sextile Jupiter, which promises no unexpected obstacles." So the message from the heavens was clear. Go house shopping. And a few weeks later, they in fact took a lease on 82 Merrion Square. And George jotted down in her diary, "Correct. Got different house and circumstances generally unexpected." But the horoscope was right. Now the planets clearly knew something that the average person couldn't see. Because in February of 1922, Merrion Square was probably one of the last places that you would think of moving in with a young family. Keep in mind that at this point their two young children, Anne was 3 years old and Michael was 1, were moving into a city that was just about to descend into civil war. Now, 1922, of course, January of 1922, was when the Anglo-Irish Treaty ending the Irish War of Independence came into effect and created the 26 counties of the Irish Free State. And while some of the population accepted this arrangement, there was another significant part of the population who didn't, and they were well organized and well armed. We were heading towards civil war. And if there was a place in Dublin where the civil war was going to be fought out at some level, it was going to be the area around Merrion Square. In April of 1922, the IRA, the members who did not accept the treaty, met in the Mansion House 2 streets over and took a vote not to recognize the Dáil. Now, Yeats's view of this doesn't give too much hint that this is going on. Here's a letter that he wrote to his friend Olivia Shakespeare in London in March 1922. George is in Dublin, he says. She has taken a large house in Merrion Square. She says the house is beautiful, with fine mantelpieces, and there's a view of the mountains. The rooms are large and stately. Now, if you step into any of the Georgian houses in Dublin, and 82 Merrion Square is a Georgian house, you very quickly realize that these are houses that are designed for entertaining. When you go in, the rooms, no matter the size of the house, the rooms have a spaciousness about them. They have high ceilings. They have high vertical windows. They have elaborate plasterwork around the coving, around the ceiling, to draw your eye upward, just as the windows draw your eyes upwards. So you walk into these rooms on the ground floor and you have a sense of space, a sense of almost walking into somewhere that is designed for entertaining. Typically, you'll go up a staircase to bring you to the first floor. And the first floors, for the most part, are designed for entertaining as well. And in fact, the first floor drawing rooms was where most people in these houses did their entertaining. Which meant that if you're in Merrion Square, you're not looking out at the street, at the traffic, you're looking out across, above it, into the square. And then the family rooms, the bedrooms and so on, would be above that. So when the Yeatses moved into 82 Merrion Square, they were moving into a house that was designed for entertaining. But they were doing so at a time when there were not very many people actually still living in Merrion Square. The writer Elizabeth Bowen was born around the corner at 15 Herbert Place in 1899. So when she was a child, she remembers going for walks. She had a governess, with her governess, into Merrion Square. And even at that point, 1906, 1907, she remembers a detail that she recounts in her wonderful memoir of childhood, 7 Winters. She remembers seeing the first brass plaques going up on Merrion Square. And sometimes the end of an era can be signaled with something as simple as a brass plaque. The brass plaques, of course, meant that these once family houses were now becoming offices for barristers, architects. They were becoming the offices for organizations. They were basically becoming commercial premises. So when the Yeatses moved into Merrion Square, they were moving in just as all the other people, if you like, were moving out. Sir John Arnott still lived there, the owner of the Irish Times, and there were some of the houses were still being made into flats. In fact, as late as the 1960s, John Banville remembers staying with an aunt who lived on Upper Mount Street, which is, of course, the continuation of the south side of Merrion Square, in a flat there. The poet Paula Meehan and her husband, also poet Theo Dorgan, lived in a flat there right up until the early 2000s, when the building was bought, turned into offices, and they had to move out. But that's not the Merrion Square that Yeats saw. The Merrion Square that Yeats saw was the one, or at least he imagined, where the Wildes lived across the square, number 1 Merrion Square, and where, in the 1860s and 1870s, they had had a famous literary salon. In a sense, he was trying to push back against time. Now, it happened that 2 doors down from where they were living, the Yeatses, at number 84 Merrion Square, the Irish Agricultural Association had its offices. And the head of the Irish Agricultural Association at the time, and also the editorial offices of their magazine, the Irish Homestead, the head of it was a man named George Russell. Now, remember that name because we're going to keep encountering in George Russell this evening. George Russell was one of Dublin's great salon attenders and salon hosts. But he worked just down from the Yeatses, which is going to prove convenient because it means that he can drop in. So, let's set the scene of what it would be like if you were going to visit the Yeatses. You walk through the front door and you find the first thing you see are paintings. Paintings by people like Charles Ricketts, who was a designer and painter who'd worked on Yeats's plays. George Yeats had a real taste for strong, solid colours, and she'd painted the furniture sort of dark blues and oranges, and even painted some of the ceilings. There were masks from Yeats's plays designed by the designer Edmund Dulac. There were paintings by Sturge Moore. There were paintings by Yeats's father, John B. Yeats. And the whole impression was one of a kind of opulence. Frank O'Connor, who as a young man had started attending Yeats's salons, remembers kind of going into the Yeats's house. And here's what he wrote in one of his memoirs. He said, "The room was kept deliberately dark, and everything in it was expensive and beautiful. The masks from his dance plays, the tall bookcases with complete sets of the classics, and the long, orderly table with tall silver candlesticks. The house may have been authentically Georgian, but the decor was pure 1890s decadence." At the same time that you're visiting the Yeatses and walking into this rather impressive house, there was a civil war going on outside. The Yeatses lived in Merrion Square from 1922, February, until roughly in 1929 when they moved to the south of France for a time. But for the first part of that, they were in the middle of a civil war. Here's a letter from George Yeats to W.B. Yeats, who was in London in November 1922. "A terrific explosion last night at 1:15, she wrote. I'm not sure where it was or what it was. The following day, she writes to her husband again. Herself and their mutual friend Thomas McGreevy had been to the cinema at the Grafton Street Picture House. Here's what she wrote in the letter. "We came down the stairs at 10:30 to find bullets whizzing down Grafton Street. Realizing that they're in the middle of a ferocious gun battle, they turned first onto Ann Street, and then they reached Dawson Street, where there was a group of medics who advised them to take a tram. So they took the tram up as far as Fitzwilliam Square and made their way back down again toward Merrion Square. They were just about to go in the door of number 82 when a ferocious machine gun battle broke out between irregular forces in Oriel House, in what would be the kind of southwestern corner of Merrion Square, more or less where the Davenport Hotel is now, and the government forces who were up on the other corner of Merrion Square, basically kind of firing back and forth at one another. And so George writes to her husband, "We decided it was too unhealthy and went to the Arts Club around the corner on Fitzwilliam Square and drank tea until 11:45. So this is the situation. Now, Civil War or not, here in Merrion Square, in December 1922, Yeats got notice that he was to become a senator in the new Seanad. And he'd be quite active, actually, until 1928. It was also here, the following year, in December of 1923, that Bert Smiley of the Irish Times phoned him up to tell him that he had won the Nobel Prize for Literature. George Russell noted that Yeats is becoming a distinguished sort of person, a senator, Nobel laureate. And yet, it's precisely at this moment, yes, the grand house, he's a senator, he's won the Nobel Prize for Literature, that Yeats decides he's going to have an open house. So on Monday night at 8:30, if you were a writer, or you were interested in literature, or you just thought you wanted to go along, you could go along to Merrion Square, knock on the door, and sit down and have an evening with the Yeatses. And that's what people did. The writer Monk Gibbon, now Monk Gibbon's not much remembered today, but he wrote novels, he wrote quite a lot of stuff. Monk Gibbon at that point knew Yeats's sisters. And in his memoir he says, Lily, who's Susan Yeats, she was known as Lily in the family, told me that W.B. Yeats was at home to friends on Monday evenings and urged me to go. She promised to explain that I was coming. For a long time, he says, I did not adopt her suggestion. He's terrified. Frank O'Connor, who later becomes quite well known as a writer, quite established as a writer, quite an arbiter of literary taste, was the same. As a young man, he found the whole prospect of going into the Yeats' house very, very daunting. He says, it was not until George Yeats called him over and says, I saw you were shy, she said to O'Connor, because you ran your hand through your hair, in exactly as Willie does. And after that, says O'Connor, I was never at a loss with Yeats. In fact, he says, he became to understand Yeats as a desperately shy man who had the effect of driving other shy people slightly dotty. So there was this strange kind of intimacy. You could just walk up to the Yeats' house on Monday evening, drop in and have a conversation. Now, along with Monk Gibbon and Frank O'Connor, there were other regulars. George Russell, who, as I mentioned, worked 2 doors down, was one of them. He was there most evenings. Another would have been Lennox Robinson, the playwright and Abbey Theatre director, known to his friends as Lynx. He had reason to be there. He was the director of the Abbey Theatre. He was writing plays. He was working quite closely with Yeats, but he also came along for the conversation. Thomas McGreevy, young poet at the time, later would become director of the National Gallery, shared rooms for a period with Lennox Robinson around the corner on Clare Street, and the two of them would have come over together sometimes. In other words, it wasn't just Yeats you were going to encounter in Merrion Square. It was his equally fascinating wife, George, and a whole group of Dublin writers. And Monk Gibbon talks about this. He says, he describes his first time he arrived to the house in an evening in December 1923, and he knocked on the door and was met by Yeats himself, brought upstairs to the drawing room and realized that the two of them were the only ones there. Presently, he says, A.E. arrived. A little later, Lennox Robinson. And then after that, George Yeats came in, talked for a bit, offered them a cup of tea or a glass of wine, and then retired. And it was really just the three of them. Now, that evening that Monk Gibbon was there, he said he spent most of the evening listening to Yeats and Lennox Robinson and A.E. talk to one another. Lennox Robinson, who was neither young nor unknown at the time, I mean, he was one of the directors of the Abbey Theatre, later recalled that that was kind of the experience for a lot of people. Here's what Robinson writes. He says, we younger people sat around rather silent, listening to this battle of the giants. Politics, Indian philosophy, and poetry were the chief topics. He said Yeats and A.E. could tell a good story, both had a sense of humor, but they did like to monologue. Monk Gibbon kind of picks up the story. He says, both of them loved talking. Both of them, in a phrase of rugby, hung on to the ball for as long as they could, developing a theme closely and continuously so that a knife blade could not be thrust between their sentences. But sooner or later it was necessary to pause, if only to take a breath, and then the other would cut in instantly and take up the theme. So if we're going to talk about Merrion Square then in terms of a conversational style, it was really almost a kind of monologue, kind of overlapping monologues. And yet, there was also occasion for wit. For all that Yeats is a major 20th century writer, he was very much a product of the 1890s. And he appreciated the kind of wit that we associate with Oscar Wilde. He also knew that Dublin, as he put it at the time, had perfect acoustics, so that if you came up with a witty line, it would echo around the city. So, for instance, on one occasion, the name of Seamus O'Sullivan came up. Seamus O'Sullivan was a writer, but primarily a literary editor, and was notoriously grumpy and had a real fondness for the drink, even by Dublin standards. And after people were talking about O'Sullivan for a few minutes, Yeats said, "The only problem with Seamus O'Sullivan is that when he's not drunk, he's sober." And that line, of course, just echoed around Dublin. So that kind of wit became part of the currency of Merrion Square. Now, because Yeats was a senator, there were also politicians who turned up from time to time. When Lady Gregory was in the drawing room one Monday evening in October of 1923, she initially found the ever-dependable A.E. and also Dermot McManus, who was a general in the Free State Army. Now, McManus gives us a sense of how complicated things were. McManus would later kind of get involved with kind of proto-fascist groups almost. But at the time, he was also the book review editor for the Irish Statesman, which was edited by A.E., who was famous around Dublin as a pacifist and as somebody who was very much set on reconciliation. So you get a sense of the kind of complexity of this literary world, where people of quite different political views would often meet in these private rooms and have conversations about literature. Yeats said he found it hard to talk to somebody like McManus. He said, "My conversation shocked and embarrassed McManus. Neither Gogarty," he means Oliver St. John Gogarty, who we'll encounter in a moment, "nor I, with our habit of outrageous conversation, could get near those men." Now, before we leave 82 Merrion Square, there's just one other detail that's worth adding in. On the first floor, for a period, the floor itself was taken up by the Koala Press and Koala Industries. Yeats's sisters, Susan and Elizabeth, known as Lily and Lolly within the family, along with another woman, Evelyn Gleeson, in 1903 had set up what they called the Dun Emer Guild to, as they said, find work for Irish hands in the making of beautiful things. "Everything as far as possible is Irish," they announced. "Paper, books, linen, embroidery, the wool of the tapestry and the carpets." So they set up a printing press and an embroidery business. And they did produce beautiful books and beautiful things. The only difficulty, of course, was that beautiful books and beautiful things were difficult to sell at a profit. And by 1923, the whole thing, the whole industry, the whole koala business was on its way to becoming almost bankrupt. Susan collapsed while she was in England in July of 1923, and something clearly had to be done. So George Yeats consulted the stars. "Am I going down a wild goose chase," she said, "in proposing to undertake the embroidery section of Koala?" The planets said no. So they moved the whole business, lock, stock, and barrel, hand press, looms, tables for embroidery, bindery, the whole lot into what would have been the downstairs rooms, the dining room and the front drawing room in 82 Merrion Square. So from that point onwards, when you arrived for the Monday night salon, you actually went through a publisher, up the stairs, and to the drawing room. And that gives you a sense of the kind of cultural density, intensity of life in Dublin at that time. And that's only Monday evening. It was Tuesday evening. We could go round to Mespel House, not too far away on the Grand Canal. It's not there anymore. And we would have found the home and the gallery and the studio of Sarah Purser, an artist in stained glass, a painter, a portrait painter, and famous wit, who every Tuesday night had her salon. On Wednesday night, we could make our way to Rathgard, of 42 Garville Avenue, where Con Curran, lawyer and patron of the arts, had his literary salon. Curran became quite close with Joyce, later wrote books about his friendship with Joyce. He was friends with James Stephens, with Porrick Colum, Seamus O'Sullivan, the ubiquitous A.E. George Russell, and every Wednesday night, people gathered in his house. Friday night, we could make our way to Ely Place, and there Oliver St. John Gogarty had his house and his literary salon on Friday evenings. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about Gogarty. He's the author of 2 hilarious memoirs, and he's quite good at recounting the conversations that took place in his house. And he loved wit. One night in his house, somebody said, "What amazes me," he said, "is that the Germans are sending professors of English to trace the imagined itinerary of Joyce's Bloom through the different pubs he's supposed to have visited." Gogarty said back, "I should hate to have my pubs stocked by German professors who are taking pub crawling seriously. The moment our pubs become the subject of literature is the moment that they are undone. Even we who patronize them would become self-conscious. And the last thing that drink should do is make a man self-conscious." Now, we could go on with Gogarty, but let's leave him, because really where I want to go is next door. Next door to where Oliver St. John Gogarty lived in Ely Place was where George Moore took up residence for a period. And it's George Moore's salon I want to drop in on next. Now, a little background first on George Moore. George Moore came from land and he came from some money. His family owned Moore Hall in County Mayo, and his father, also called George Moore, George Henry Moore, was a politician and a horse breeder. But George Moore, the son, always had an interest and a predilection for art and for writing, and he spent much of his younger years first of all in Paris and then in London. When he was in Paris, he was friends with people like Manet and Degas and Goncourt, painters, writers. When he was in London, he was friends with people like James McNeill Whistler, the painter. But by the end of the 1890s, he became convinced that the center of literary and artistic energy had moved from Paris to London to Dublin. "When art died in France," he said, "I returned to England. And now that art was dead in England, I was like one looking out in a watchtower to see which way it was winding." It was winding, he decided, towards Dublin. Now, once again, our friend George Russell, the other George, AE, comes into the picture. In the 1890s, George Russell had been a member of an organization called the Theosophical Society, who had owned a house in Ely Place, and he knew that there was a property for rent there. So he told George Moore, "This is the place for you." Now, the house in Ely Place had certain advantages for George Moore. He describes it as a modest little house. It's nothing of the sort. It's, again, a Georgian house in a fairly intact terrace. The house is still there today. And it's one of those kind of Georgian houses that is only a few rooms deep, but is quite high, and the streetscape is quite uniform. So having acquired a house on Ely Place, George Moore, who had spent most of his life amongst artists, decided he needed to decorate it. Or I suppose we might think of it like a set. He now had his set, so he needed to decorate the set. So he painted the walls in the hall green. He got a green carpet for the hall. And of course, he had to have the door match the rest of the corridor. So he painted the door green, inside and out. Now, that may not sound like a serious thing to do, but the thing about a Georgian terrace is that a Georgian terrace involves a certain sense of community, that people are not going to do anything too radical. And in the early years of the 20th century, painting your door green was considered radical. And it produced a row with the neighbours, which was just the sort of thing that George Moore loved. Yeats wrote to Lady Gregory, "What a queer person Moore is. He is constantly so likeable that no one can believe evil of him. And then, in a moment, a kind of devil takes hold of him, and his voice changes, and his look changes, and he becomes perfectly hateful." The devil certainly came out in George Moore after he painted his door green. He immediately found himself locked into conflict with his neighbours. They more or less petitioned him to paint the door back again. No, he wasn't. He was going to leave it green. He had 2 neighbours in particular, 2 women named Drew, with whom he found himself particularly at war. They had dogs, And apparently the dogs used to occasionally leave their droppings on More's doorstep. More claimed not only did they kind of poop on his doorstep, he also said that the women used to beat the dogs until they howled, which was unlikely. He also wrote to someone that there were noisy persons who rode their bicycles round and round before my door, ringing their bells and looking at my hall door. He claimed another neighbor had actually hired an organ grinder with a monkey to stand outside his door and annoy him. Now, I don't know how much of this is actually true. What we do know, actually, is probably was true, is that the two Miss Drews bought a copy of More's novel, Esther Waters, which was quite notorious because it involved a woman who had had sexual relations outside marriage, and bought a copy of it, tore it into shreds, and posted it through his letterbox with a note that said, "Too filthy to be kept in any home." More wrote a little poem about them. "My neighbours, the dirty Miss Drews, stand on their doorstep and muse, and tie up their tresses while their dogs make their messes, and I am wiping my shoes," which he used to recite at the top of his voice with the windows wide open so that they could hear him. Now, the other attraction of Ely Place, apart from having ructions with the neighbours, was that it was near the National Library. And so More started to become a regular user of the National Library. And there he met a librarian, a man named, well, who's known as John Eglinton. His real name was William Kirkwood McGee, but like so many people in Dublin at the time, he was known by his pen name, John Eglinton. "It happened I was situated to be just the man for him," Eglinton later wrote. His notion of the librarian being the common one of a man with nothing to do all day but read. Typically what More used to do was arrive down to the National Library just before it closed at 10 o'clock and ask Eglinton for something to read, or more often ask him about a particular book to save himself the trouble of reading it. I once told this story to a friend of mine who was a librarian in the National Library, Jerry Kavanagh, just retired. I said, "What would you do if somebody showed up to the library just at closing time and asked for something to read?" And Jerry said, "I'd give them something to read, the exit sign." Well, Eglinton didn't do that. He became friends with More, but he became fascinated by the fact that George More, who was a very well-established writer at this point, didn't appear to read. More never acquired the habit of reading, Eglinton observed. And he even had something of the puzzled admiration of an illiterate person for those who could content themselves with this resource. George More's brother, Maurice More, also commented. He said, "The truth is that no writer has read less literature than George More." Conversation, then, kept More literate without the tedium or the necessity of having to actually read books. It also kept him supplied with gossip. He wrote on more than one occasion that the acoustics of Dublin are perfect. Susan Mitchell, who was one of the attendees at his salons, said, "No jest, be it whispered ever so softly in the closet, failed to be heard on the remotest housetop in Dublin. It is an ideal home for clever talkers." And so George More instituted his salon in number 4 Ely Place. Who was there? Well, his friend John Eglinton, the librarian, he was there. George Russell, AE, our friend who we keep finding, was there as well. Susan Mitchell, who worked with George Russell in The Irish Statesman, also came along. Famous as a wit, really good author of satires. Jove thunders from Olympus, she wrote, and more from Ely Place. Lady Gregory sometimes went. Yeats seems to have been drawn back against his better judgment, but his father, John Butler Yeats, was regularly there. John Butler Yeats later wrote, "I always feel morally better for being with More," which shows a certain perversity, because More took delight in being as amoral or immoral as possible. John Millington Synge came along once, but there were others. James Stephens, author of The Charwoman's Daughter or The Crock of Gold, was a regular. Seamus O'Sullivan, who we've heard of before, was there. Pádraig Colum came along. And of course, Oliver St. John Gogarty was almost a resident of the house. He virtually lived next door. The arch mocker, Moore called him. The author of all the jokes that enable us to live in Dublin. A lot of those conversations ended up being recorded or written down. And Moore had a tendency to be able to turn any aspect of the conversation to something sexual. For instance, one evening, Richard Best, who was a respected scholar of Irish philology and later became director of the National Library, was listening to Moore read out something he had written and suggested an improvement. He said, you could change one of the verbs. Moore, said Best, what you want there is subjunctive. The subjunctive will get you out of that sentence. Moore said, but what is the subjunctive? Best said, oh, well, the subjunctive mood is if you say, if it rains, we shall not go. Qui soit in French, you know. Moore says, oh, I would give anything to be able to use the subjunctive. If it be, if it rain. How wonderful. I shall always use the subjunctive. Best continues on, true scholarly style. There are, of course, he says, various forms of the subjunctive. The jussive subjunctive, for instance, as in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Why ever not, says Moore. I've been doing so all my life. Suddenly you're on to a completely different topic. That's what it was like talking with George Moore. Nobody quite knew when he was serious. He was very fond of talking about his romantic entanglements. But Susan Mitchell once commented, some men kiss and do not tell, some kiss and tell. George Moore tells but does not kiss. In any case, all of his conversation, as his secretary later wrote, sooner or later found its way into his books. I do not think George Moore has had serious ideas about anything except his own writing, A.E. told a book reviewer in 1920. So what George Moore started to do was invite all these people around to the house in Ely Place, give them a good meal, and start the kind of conversations about literature that were typical in a salon. And then when everybody was gone, he would run upstairs to his study and start to write it all down. So he began to use his salon like a kind of laboratory, a place in which he could generate conversation by throwing out outrageous suggestions. So, for instance, one evening he was talking to George Russell, A.E., and he put forward the very strange proposition that a Catholic country could not produce a decent literature. Here's more. I've made a discovery that will revolutionize Ireland. Dogma and literature are incompatible. There's no such thing as a Catholic literature. When I say no Catholic literature, I mean that 95% of the world's literature was written by Protestants and agnostics. And, Russell, who actually was Protestant, tried to talk him out of this. But George Moore was having none of it. And a few weeks later, he tries out the same argument on Edward Martyn. Now, Edward Martyn was one of the three original founders of the Abbey Theatre, along with W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory. He sort of fell away relatively quickly, but he was an extremely devout Catholic, fascinated with Catholic liturgy, and in fact was one of the founders of the Palestrina Choir, which still exists in Dublin, and in his lifetime donated the equivalent in today's money of about £1 million toward the Palestrina Choir. So he's not the sort of person you're going to put forward the proposition that Catholic countries don't produce literature. Here's the conversation as it was recorded. Martyn, what has this got to do with the Irish Renaissance? Moore says, only this, Edward. Of what use is it to change the language? In other words, to move toward the Irish language, since Catholics cannot write. Martyn says, so your great discovery is that the Irish Renaissance is nothing but a bubble. What about your mission to make Dublin a literary centre? Moore says, "Good God, I hadn't thought of that. My life has been sacrificed for a bubble." Martin says, "But you knew Ireland was a Catholic country." So this is what Moore would do. He would throw out these outrageous suggestions, no sense of whether he believed in them or not, simply to see how people would respond. And that became what is probably his greatest work, Hail and Farewell, the 3 volumes of autobiography that he writes about his years in Dublin. Now, before he published Hail and Farewell, he also made the, you could say, mistake of reading it to his guests on the Saturday evenings. Moore is still in Dublin, A.E. wrote to John Quinn, who was a benefactor in New York. Still bidding eternal farewells to Ireland and working on his farewell book. One half of Dublin is afraid that they will be in the book, and the other half is afraid that they won't. And then later on, he writes again to John Quinn. He says, "Willie Yeats, I think, feels a little uneasy about this book. And I know a great many other people, T.P. Gill, who was a publisher, T.W. Rolston, who was a writer, Edward Martin, and a number of others." By the time the first volume of Hail and Farewell appeared in 1911, Moore could no longer stay in Dublin, and he left for London, where he remained for most of the rest of his life. Further volumes appeared in 1912 and 1914. An extract of the 3rd volume that appeared in 1914 that suggested that Lady Gregory's family were undistinguished and had attempted to convert some of the Catholic tenants on the estate, produced a response from her that left no doubt as to what she felt about the book. "I do not think you will be allowed to be repeated in your book what you have written. And if you do, I shall be forced to seek legal advice," she told him. Nobody has ever used a literary salon, I think, in quite the same way as George Moore. He couldn't stay in Dublin afterwards, but when he was there, he sure had fun. So let's leave George Moore's house, number 4 Ely Place, shuttered on a Saturday evening, and make our way into Sunday. Well, on Sunday morning, we could go to Clare Street, where Lennox Robinson had a kind of Sunday morning. He says, "I didn't have an evening, I had a morning." He'd invite people around for coffee. And then the group who were gathered in Robinson's would generally make their way up to Rathgar, where Seamus O'Sullivan had a Sunday afternoon. But the real highlight of Sunday was George Russell's salon in Rathgar Avenue, 17 Rathgar Avenue, where from 1907 until almost 1930, late 1929, 1930, which is a long stretch, every Sunday evening, George Russell, A.E., had people over to his house. So that's where we're going to head. Now, the building survives today. It looks like it's an ordinary red brick terrace house. What looks like the basement is in fact a lower level that opens out onto a garden at the rear. But the main floor, you go up a flight of stairs to it, it's only 1 floor and it's sort of 2 rooms deep. It doesn't have quite the volume of the big Georgian rooms that George Moore or that W.B. Yeats had, but it was big enough to be quite an active salon. Now, Russell is a fascinating figure because as well as being a poet, a novelist, he was also a painter, and he was the editor of the Irish Statesman, and before that, the Irish Homestead. He had a huge influence on the Irish literature of the early part of the 20th century. As well as being all these things, George Russell was a visionary. And what I mean by a visionary would become immediately apparent to you when you walk through his front door. So let's go to 17 Rathgar Avenue. Let's go up those stairs, through the door. And the first thing you notice when you walk into what is the main room is that the walls are painted, not colors, but with figures, with creatures. George Russell, from the time he was in his late teens, saw visions. He saw what he believed to be a spirit world that existed alongside our own. They took the form of warriors, horses, nymphs, spirits. And because he was quite a talented painter, he was able to paint these figures. And he paints them as if, it's almost as if they have their own interior light source, as if they kind of glow. And he painted canvases. Sean O'Casey, who was one of the people who went to his salon, arrived and was flabbergasted to find the sheer number of paintings that were just laying around the walls. In his memoirs, he says, a harvest of them, 48, 49, 50, 51. It's a huge number of paintings all around the walls. But Russell also painted directly onto the walls. So you're in this relatively ordinary looking house in Rathgar Avenue. You go through the door and the walls are covered with these spiritual beings. Around the walls where there are not paintings, there are bookshelves. He had 3 different sections of bookshelves. He had a section of books on spiritual, religious, theosophical, occult matters. He didn't loan those. He had a section of books on Irish literature, and he was famous for just giving people books. Oh, you need to read this, hand them a book. And then books on economic matters. And remember, he was editing the Irish Homestead, which was a magazine primarily for the farming community. So there's books on agriculture as well. Everybody went to A.E.'s house. Lady Gregory was there a number of times, we know from her diaries. John Eglinton, the librarian who did George Moore's reading for him, was there most nights, or most Sunday nights. And all of the younger poets, as A.E. once describes them, Porrick Colum, Seamus O'Sullivan, James Stephens. And in fact, there's almost a kind of generational thing you start to see. Just take a few dates. Okay, Lady Gregory's born in 1852, so she's a little bit older than most of the people that she's associating with, but she starts writing late. But Yeats is born 1865. George Russell's born 1867. George Russell's co-editor of the Irish Homestead, Susan Mitchell, famous wit, is also born 1866. Catherine Tynan, another novelist of the period, born 1861. So by, say, 1907, when Russell starts his salon, they're all established writers in their 40s. But there's another generation there. Porrick Colum's born 1881. Longtime editor of the Dublin magazine, Seamus O'Sullivan's born 1879. James Stephens, author of The Crock of Gold, The Insurrection, number of different books, born 1880. James Joyce, who also comes along to Russell's house, born 1882. So you have this generation who are in their 20s, who are taking advantage of the fact that here are a group of older, more established writers, editors, people who can get them published, and are attending this salon in order to help get themselves published and to learn about literature. And there's even a later generation. Patrick Kavanagh, born 1904, Austin Clarke, born 1896. People who are publishing into the 1960s and 70s are starting to go to A.E. salons. Frank O'Connor, born 1903. Now, as I move toward a conclusion, I want to give an example of what these salons could mean to a writer. In 1907, the 27-year-old James Stephens published an essay simply called Poetry. George Russell read it, thought, this is good. Want to find out who this James Stephens was. Dublin's a small enough city. Made a few inquiries, realized that Stephens worked a few doors down from him in Marion Square. Remember, George Russell worked at 84 Marion Square. The Yeatses lived at 82 in the 1920s. Stephens worked at 91. So he pops down to where James Stephens works, tells him to come along to his salon on Sunday evening. Stephens comes along, Russell meets him, and then Russell goes along on the Saturday evening to George Moore's salon and says to Moore, we need to publish this guy. James Stephens, he says, has enough poetry in him to make a great prose writer, which is a great kind of backhanded compliment, but a compliment nonetheless. From that point on, Stephens becomes a fixture in Rathgar Avenue, becomes a friend of Russell, and he starts publishing He publishes a collection of poetry about the Dublin tenements, Insurrections, 1909, and then a series of novels, The Crock of Gold and The Charwoman's Daughter, both in 1912. He briefly goes to Paris, doesn't like it. He says there's nothing to be found here but drink and syphilis in astonishing variety, and then returns back to Dublin and settles not far from the Russells at number 2 Leinster Square. He then writes what is arguably the definitive account, eyewitness account of the Easter Rising, the insurrection in Dublin, 1916, and starts to become almost like a kind of talent scout for Russell. He says, there's a new man, Clark, and this is Austin Clark, who goes on to become one of the major Irish poets of the middle 20th century, who has poetry in him. So they start kind of looking at these other writers, including James Joyce. So Russell becomes the first person to publish one of Joyce's stories in the Irish homestead. Now I want to end with Russell, because in some ways his salon does what writers' workshops and creative writing courses in some ways do today. They allow writers to gather. They allow more established writers to talk to writers who are just starting to learn their craft. They make connections, they allow people to get published, they enable literature. And I think if we want to go back to the question that we started with, what are some of the things that makes Dublin into a literary city? And I started out by listing the great works, the institutions, but always I've had this sense that there was something I was missing, something elusive. And I think part of the answers to what that elusive thing is conversation, the thing that kind of just floats up into the air. And what you start to realize is that at a period in Dublin's history when literature was just so vibrant, so active, that people recognized the value of conversation to the extent that they opened their houses, opened their homes, and they did so in a very organized kind of way. You could attend salons Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. In an essay in the Irish Homestead in December of 1921, just in between that sort of uneasy period between the end of the War of Independence and the start of the Civil War, George Russell wrote an editorial in the Irish Homestead. And he says, this is a Christmas editorial. A kindly, good-natured life, the easy meeting of friends, the cultivation of humanities, music, literature, the arts and sciences. These are the crown of civilization. It is the labor of ages to reach this, to tame the brute in men, to make them cooperate. A kindly, good-natured life, the easy meeting of friends. Maybe that's what it's all about. Maybe that is one of the things that allows a city like Dublin to be a city of literature. That meeting of friends, those conversations.